We'll be providing closed captioning throughout the presentation. And on the bottom of your screen, as I'm sure all of you have noticed, there's the chat feature. Please share any comments and questions throughout the session there. We will be keeping an eye out for your questions, and we'll do our best to cover as many of them as we can today. We'd also like to thank you for sharing your questions through the Eventbrite registration. We've shared them with our speakers who will do their best to answer as many of them as they can during the session today. So we look forward to a great session, and now I'll be passing it on to Cole so that he can introduce himself.
Hi everyone, my name is Cole Arnett. I am the Client Experience Intern at Edge. Looking forward to enjoying the session just as each of you are going to do so. I don't really have much to add for what Simi said, so looking forward to how things go so far. All right.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so just a little bit about Edge. I feel like most of you know what Edge is and what we do. So again, just to summarize, we are Sheridan's home for entrepreneurs and change makers, and we act as a bridge into the community and into Sheridan itself. We support aspiring entrepreneurs and change makers, whether students, faculty, staff, and entrepreneurs in the community, and we provide training and mentorship program when we will be back at Sheridan Workspace as well. And of course, we have opportunities for funding for our members from time to time with our community partners as well. These are some of the, okay, so in terms of focus areas, creativity is central to Sheridan as a creative campus, as well as human-centered design. We really are proud of the inclusive community that we do have at Edge, represented in all facets, from our ventures to the work that they do, as well as our team. And lastly, we're very proud to also host social entrepreneurs, social innovators like Ryan Knight, who I will introduce, and others in our community that are really dedicated to people, planet, profit, and having impact in different ways in our community. These are some of the partners and supporters that we're very proud to be affiliated with. Sheridan itself, we do some core programming that we collaborate on with IQUTM, as well as others that you see. I'll highlight the Community Foundations of Canada because that collaboration is very relevant to our conversation tonight, and with the working groups that we will be hosting around the Investment Readiness Program specifically. And we'll talk to that momentarily. Well, let's keep it rolling. In terms of our programs, many of you know, I'm not going to belabor this. Essentially, we provide core programming for entrepreneurs as well as change makers at all stages of the venture development process. And through our programming, we serve many participants through a variety of different offerings that are open to the community, like our session tonight. I'm going to pass this on to Sneha, if you don't mind, if you can please give us an intro to the IRP and any updates that you'd like to share before we jump into our regular programming.
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is Sneha and I'm the Client Experience Coordinator at Edge, and I'm also the local contact for the IRP. And the Investment Readiness Program is essentially a fund for social purpose organizations who are looking to develop their organizations to become ready for future investment. So you can apply for up to, from $10,000 to $100,000 in non-repayable grant money. And the applications opened on September 8th, and they will be open, I believe, until October 9th. And so we'll be referencing the IRP throughout this workshop, and we hope that many of you are applying. And if you are applying and you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me after this workshop. And also, if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat. But if you need support on your application or have any clarifying questions, I'm here to help and support you.
Okay, so now for the main event. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Bethany Osborne and Ryan Knight. Starting with Bethany, Dr. Osborne is an innovative community practitioner, educator, researcher with over 20 years of experience building and engaging diverse communities. Over her extensive career, she's worked with many diverse organizations, enjoying a key role in supporting community transformation through innovation and creative programs and project design, certainly grant writing, as well as working with community leaders to develop dynamic projects that affect social change. And Bethany has been an incredible partner with us over the last year. I want to personally thank you for the programming and the heart and soul that you put into everything that you offer. Super appreciated. As well as Ryan. So Ryan Knight is a serial social entrepreneur who is passionate about building inclusive, sustainable, and resilient communities using social enterprise as the mechanism. He's the founder of Detailing Knights, as well as ACBN Canada. Detailing Knights is a B Corp certified waterless mobile car cleaning company that uses a student franchising model to teach entrepreneurship to local at-risk youth. ACBN Canada holds monthly networking events and business building workshops to help solidify the foundation of local minority-owned businesses to ensure they're sustainable and continue to grow. And again, Ryan, thank you so much for your collaboration over this month with the various sessions that we've been working with you on as well, and for being a part of our community. Thank you. And so over to you folks for the presentation. So Bethany, will let you share your slides and get started.
Fantastic. It's always kind of funny to look at your pictures of when we used to dress up for work. Seems to kind of be
yeah, I haven't worn dress shoes in like 6 months.
Yeah, I know. It's just a new world. Delighted to be here with you again this evening. I saw a lot of familiar faces from last week, or familiar names at least from last week and from last night. And tonight is another exciting day when we are actually going to move on to the second part of writing funding applications. And so last week, for those of you who were here last week, hopefully you remember that we talked last week, just a little bit of a review. We talked a little bit about fundraising strategies and social enterprises, talked about how you determine a fit and what do you do before you apply, and some of the steps that you take to create a strong funding application. And then we talked about what makes a compelling story, and then we talked about drafting your funding strategy and creating a core narrative. And then we touched a little bit on fundraising in the age of COVID. I gave you a little bit of homework. I'd be interested to know from those of you who were here last week, the homework that I gave you was the first part of developing a strong funding proposal is to develop a core narrative. So a story that you can draw from for every funding application that you're going to have to write in the future. So we were talking about before you all joined us about how funding deadlines can come up at inconvenient times, like at the beginning of an academic year when you've got lots of things going on, or sometimes they can come up at surprising times, and you can find out about a grant at the very last minute. And so one of the great things about actually having a core narrative and having lots of prepared materials that you can draw from is that you're able to actually put together a funding proposal much more quickly when you've done all of that work. So I'd be interested to know, did anyone in this past week, because we all have lots of free time, especially in September, did anyone dabble around a little bit with developing their core narrative or developing their project story? And in the folder that we provided last week, there was a sample, and then there was a template and some instructions for you to work with. And and if you did it, what was the process like for you? Or if you didn't, what were the challenges that you faced as you thought about doing it and you thought, oh my gosh, this is maybe a little bit too intimidating for me, but what were the things that were challenging for you if you thought about doing it?
And we encourage you to put your hand up if you'd like to use your mic, and we'll come to you. I think we all gain more when we hear from one another. And if you're not comfortable with that, then please use the chat and we'll make sure that your comment and question is answered or responded to. So the question is, where can we find the sample of last week? We will post the link to the folder for you in this chat box momentarily. Thank you for that question. So Sophia says, I found this series a bit late and did not join the previous session. Could you share the folder again? Absolutely, we will share that. And also we'll share the recording from the last session again, so that you can watch the last session as well as access the folder with the handouts that Bethany's speaking to, as well as her slides.
Okay. So did
anyone else? And Cole, would you mind sharing the recording as well for last week's session? That would be awesome for those that weren't able to join.
As we're waiting for somebody to chime in, I'm noticing Sherry and the last name Loye, and how you mentioned or how you described your company is, I'm wondering if you did the homework, because it's very succinct and descriptive. And she put it into the chat, and just to read it for everyone, that I work with an organization called Distinctability, which works with people with neurodiversity to gain and retain employment. We have brought a human blend assistive technology system to Canada and are working on increasing the social enterprise part of our operations, as well as being able to offer the tech as a social enterprise to our partners. That, to me, is a great organizational story, like brand story. And so if anybody wants an example, they could use that kind of snippet that would start how you produce your own story. I just felt like I wanted to highlight that.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Ryan. For those of you who haven't had a chance to take a look at the template, what the template does is actually provide you with a couple of what I would call prompts, or questions that you can ask yourself in each different area. And the template is actually based on the kinds of questions that funders actually would ask you in a funding application. So they're not exactly the question that is going to be on every single funding application, but it is more of a composite, so that you're developing a core story and thinking about how you are going to tell your story and tell it well. Telling it in a way that someone that doesn't know you or your project could read it and know what your project is about. And that's exactly why Ryan highlighted, and I'm sorry I missed the name of the example that you highlighted, but it's the idea is that you want to be developing a story that someone could read without expertise in your area, because you are all subject matter experts in your area, and you are all so full of passion about your ideas and your ventures. And you want to develop your stories in a way that instills that sense of passion in a clear and concise way to someone who reads your story. So I encourage you to take a look at the materials that I provided from last week, and we're going to continue to refer to your story, but that core narrative is not the only way that you tell your story when you're writing a grant proposal.
Bethany, do you mind if I just pipe in quickly?
Yeah,
if
sure.
you don't mind. So we have, I wanted to just mention, Amelie, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. There's another question
Sure.
of how you can access last week's material. If you scroll up in the chat, you'll notice a YouTube link, which has the recording from last week's session with Ryan and Bethany, as well as a Google Drive link that has all the presentation materials and handouts. So just please scroll up in the chat and you'll see both links there. Sorry to interrupt, please proceed.
Oh, no, that's great.
Yeah, and don't feel like you have to watch the previous one in order to get it today. Today, they do connect, but today's session can stand alone. So don't feel like you're behind.
Yes, absolutely.
So today, we're going to talk about the steps that you take to create a strong funding application. We're going to look at the essential components of a work plan and the essential components of a budget. And then we're going to talk about bringing those pieces together. So by the end of this workshop, you should be able to review the different steps to create a strong funding application, to define the essential components of a work plan, and to practice the step-by-step development of a project-specific work plan and budget, and to leave the session with the components that you need to work on your next funding application. So often the components of a funding proposal are a cover letter, a project summary, and a cover letter somewhere in between there would often be an organizational profile as well that is required by a funder. The project summary would include your story. So what will you do? What's the challenge you're solving, the needs you're meeting, who your target population is, what's the community you're working in, who are your partners, your collaborators, and your stakeholders. It would include a work plan or a project plan of some sort, and it's taken up in a variety of different ways depending on the funding proposal that you're working on, which would include things like goals and objectives, timelines, impacts, and an evaluation plan, and then a budget. And they come together in a variety of different ways depending on the type of funding application you're writing and who the funder is, but these are generally the different components that you would find in a funding proposal. We talked about the story last week, and we'll continue to kind of touch back and forth with your story. But the work plan, also known as your project work plan, is one of the things that we're going to concentrate on today. And a work plan is really the heart of your proposal, because it's actually the map that the funder is actually going to use to navigate your project. You're going to write how you will run the project to achieve the specific objectives that you have for your project. You describe steps that you're going to actually take to meet your project goals. And a project work plan is actually a tool that helps you either plan or manage implementation of, or to report on, or to evaluate your project. And it often has two components. It can describe how the project will be implemented to achieve your outcome. And it can include things like inputs, activities, a time frame, who's going to be responsible for different parts of the project, and also the output. So what is going to be an output of the project. It's also going to describe how you evaluate whether you've actually had an impact. Has a particular project outcome actually been achieved? Including whether you're collecting any data, and it also includes your time frame. The work plan will help you to do things like planning your project by outlining your activities, and also managing the implementation of your project by helping you to actually track your project. Work plans can look very different, and depending on who the funder is and what's required by a funder, it also can help you report on your progress and evaluate your outcomes as well. And often work plans are created through something called a logic model. Has anyone ever seen anything that looks a little bit like this? Have you ever had to fill anything out that looks like this? It doesn't have to be for a funding proposal. It could be for something that you've done in a workplace, maybe even for something you had to do for school. In what places have you seen something that looks like this? A table that looks like this?
So we have project plans, research proposal, the smart marketing.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a very, very common model to use. And the reason it's called a logic model is that it is supposed to be logical. It's meant to present information, or it's meant to present data in a logical order so that anyone can look at your work plan, look at the page and understand how things will run. And in this case, look at how a project will run. And I think probably the first grant that I ever wrote was probably 25 years ago. And I didn't have to fill out a work plan. I think it was actually probably 20 years ago that work plans actually started being a very common thing that was required, I think initially by the government. And then it became a very common practice for funders to ask for some kind of work plan. And it can look a little bit overwhelming when you first look at a page like this. There's a lot of columns in it. But it is actually really systematic, and it actually really makes a lot of sense when you walk through it step by step. So I'd like to walk with you step by step through the different steps of the work plan, so that when you encounter something like this, when you're writing a funding proposal, you're like, oh yeah, that's just a logic model. I can totally do that. That's totally easy. That's totally simple. That's logical to me. So step one. Now, the first thing that you need to do is to come up with a goal or objective for a project. And a goal is a broad intention, and an objective is something that is precise. So a goal can't be measured, but an objective can be measured. And this is the simplest way that I know of to actually describe these two things. Sometimes when you first look at all of these words that are asked by funders on an application, you think, oh my gosh, what is it that they're asking me? Essentially, they're asking you to think broadly and then to narrow it down and to think more precisely. So if you're actually thinking of an example, a goal might be very broadly promoting healthy living for youth living in Peel region. And your objective, which is very tangible, would be to, and very precise and action-oriented, would be to increase the knowledge of nutrition and exercise by providing nutritional counseling to youth ages 12 to 19 living in the Lundy Village community in Brampton from pre to post project involvement, and to increase the number of youth ages 12 to 19 participating in recreational programs within 1 year. So if we look So an objective is actually a short-term measurable step within a designated period of time that actually moves towards achieving a long-term goal. And an objective should be SMART. So it should be specific, it should be measurable, it should be achievable, it should be results-oriented, and it should be time specific. So if we look at the statements that I made in terms of these objectives, looking at these particular statements, and my arrows got a little bit, they're a little bit all over the place. So this actually looks like a hot mess here on the screen. But if you actually, so pretend that you don't see any arrows here, but look at instead just the different words that are part of SMART objectives. So specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and time-specific. And if you look at the statements here, can anyone tell me anything specific about the statements that I created for my goal is to increase healthy living for youth within PL region? So is there anything specific about my objective statements that I have here?
So we have the age of the youth, we have age range, location.
Location, great. Anything that's measurable?
Participation.
Participation is measurable,
It's
sure.
time specific 1 year.
Okay, time specific 1 year, great.
We have pre versus post.
Yeah, and so pre versus post is time specific. And I would also say that that's measurable, right? So you're looking at pre to post. And so increasing knowledge from pre to post is actually measurable.
Bethany, could you comment on, we have a question from Crystal, and she's just seeking clarification on what is knowledge of nutrition and exercise. So what does that mean exactly?
No, sorry, that was my, sorry, Jeff, that wasn't a question. It was just an example of one thing that was specific.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying. That's hilarious.
But you know what? But you know what? That is also.
Yeah, Crystal. Like, what's nutrition?
Yeah.
I know. I'm sorry.
I'm teasing.
No. But I mean, this is so. I would say that that's one thing that is tricky when you're trying to actually take something that is actually qualitative, right? So if you're increasing knowledge, how do you take, so yesterday we had actually a conversation about how do you take something that is qualitative and how do you actually make it quantitative, right? How do you make it measurable? And so I appreciate, even though that was actually a miscommunication, it actually gives a good example of how you can give a funder the kind of measurement that they actually want. So they are okay to have qualitative measurements, but they also want to have some quantitative measurements because funders often need, because also funders get money from different constituents. And so being able to show for themselves, it's not that they only want quantitative things, but they have to be accountable to someone as well. And quantitative measurements are very helpful. So pre to post involvement, so increasing knowledge. So if you measure whether or not someone had confidence or whether they had some knowledge and they increased their knowledge, you can actually measure that by doing a pre-test and a post-test.
So
Bethany,
I gave an example that I worked on. That was a 3-year project. The funding was from Trillium Foundation. And it was an after-school program for diverse youth, girls specifically within certain grades. And so this is a great example where they used the wellness index as one, and they did a pre and a post, and they reported the analysis to the funders for the participants, but also the teachers in that case as well.
Right. And so then you get this, so there's all sorts of, you're right. There's lots of great measurement tools that you can use. And so that's one way of providing some quantitative data. And then you have simple things like increasing numbers of participation in programs within 1 year. And so, and it's results oriented, right? So you're increasing knowledge, you're increasing participation in programs within a year. And so this is the kind of goal, kind of objective that is specific and is smart, that you want to articulate to a funder that shows them, makes them sit up and say, all right, okay, I can see that this, that the person who's applying here is actually knows what they're doing and is posing something that is going to be results oriented. And so, and this also, we're going to talk a little bit later also about scope as well. Because the other thing that you want to also think about is how that I would also, in terms of objectives, if I was actually running this particular project, is I would also think about how many youth, if according to how much funding I had, how many youth could I actually have participating in this? So these are the kinds of things you also need to think about when you're thinking about your objectives as well.
Do we have time for 2 more questions?
Of course we do, yeah.
Okay, so we have, which measurement tool do you suggest? My response would be, it really depends.
Yeah, well, it depends on what your, it depends what your project is. And you don't have to use a particular measurement tool unless your project lends itself to a specific measurement tool. Mm-hmm. So it made sense. So Golnaz mentioned the particular tool she did because it made sense because of the project she was working with.
For the goals of that project,
absolutely.
And in some cases, funders will require you to use, depending on what the funding criteria is, they may have their own tool that they require you to use in some cases.
Yeah.
As well. So it really does depend. I don't think there is one right or specific answer. But Chris, if you have like a follow-up question, feel free to throw it in the chat. We also have, would it be too risky to state in the second objective, increase the number of youth ages within 1 year by X? So I guess, is the concern there, Jose, that what if you don't actually, so 1 year increase by X%, would it be too risky to be that specific?
No.
Is the concern that what if you don't meet that target? Bethany, if you can comment.
Yeah, so no.
And Brian.
So I would say, no, it doesn't, but this piece, and I was jumping ahead a little bit. I mean, this is how everything comes together and how the story, all the pieces come together. But you need to make sure that based on your full story, the amount of money that you have in terms of the amount of money and resources that you have with your project, the scope of your project, that you can actually sustain that. So if you were to say you had $100,000 for a project, and you have and a project for $100,000, and you said you were going to increase the participation by 2,000 youth. As a funder, I would look at that and I would be, wow, okay. I'm not sure how you're going to do that. I would question your capacity to be able to do that, given $100,000 is not a lot of money, because we're going to talk later about where that money goes and how you're going to do that. And you're going to provide nutritional counseling, and you're going to increase youth participating in recreational programs. I would look at all of the activities that were involved in your project, and I would think, who's going to do that? And how are you going to do that? And I'm not sure they know what they're talking about. But if you were going to say you want to increase by 10%, or you want to, like, then I might say, okay, that makes more sense given the scope of the entire project. However, if you were going to increase, if you had $1 million and you were going to increase by 2,000 youth, I might say, okay, great. You've got a whole bunch of staff and you could do that, right? So you want to think about the scope, how much time you have. So within 1 year, how much money you have, and what you've said you're going to do in the project. So if you were only going to spend your entire time just doing recruitment for recreational programs, maybe 2,000 people would be possible. But if you're also going to be providing nutritional counseling and doing a bunch of measurements, and you've only got one person employed by the project, that's not going to be possible. So does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
And one other thing to add on to that too is funders now, especially with the IRP, are looking at return on investment. So
right.
If you get $1 million and you're only gonna impact, let's say 200 youth, they'd really wanna see, like, where is all this money going only to have that little bit of impact. Right. You'd wanna be able to reverse engineer these goals that you've set to understand what exactly you have to do and how much money it'll take to do that. So keeping in mind that.
Yeah, and Ryan, that is such a great point. And here's the good news. The work plan actually enables you to reverse engineer what you're going to do, because you're actually creating a process, and so that is my cue to move forward about creating a work plan. Okay, so step 2. From your objectives, you actually start thinking about your activities. So your activities are your to-dos to actually achieve your objective. So if we were going to take those objectives, what might be some of the activities that you would do to actually achieve these objectives? So you're running this project, and you're going to increase knowledge of nutrition and exercise, and you're going to increase the number of youth participating in recreational programs within 1 year. Just, I know you're not all subject matter experts in, or maybe some of you are, in youth and nutrition and exercise and recreation. Possibly you are, but taking a stab in the dark, maybe. What would be some of the activities that you might think about doing if this were one of your objectives? Any thoughts?
We have seminars.
So running seminars, okay. What kind of seminars?
So I'm thinking like nutrition seminars to increase knowledge.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so writing nutrition seminars, great, love it.
Cooking classes.
Cooking classes, love it. Yeah, very nice. We're all hungry right now because it's around dinner time. I'm thinking about dinner right now too. Yeah, great. So you might run some cooking classes.
So we have, it's a stab in the dark. All ideas are good. Don't be shy, folks. We love it when you put them in the chat box. Going to grocery stores and setting up a booth.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Yeah. Going to grocery stores, setting up a booth.
Programs at schools. So like, I guess after school programs or programs that might integrate.
Yeah.
In schools. Amazing.
Yeah. Love it. If we were thinking about the age of COVID, maybe cooking classes online, right? Like, so sadly, possibly for the foreseeable future, maybe no more tasty samples at Costco. I don't know, possibly not. But yeah, so those are great ideas of integrating and increasing. And participating in recreational programs, there may be different ways of engaging. So you would choose a number of activities that would meet with the objectives. And from there, you want to think about what is it that you actually need in order to achieve each of these activities. And so when you look at, and this is a different example. I wanted to give more than one example. So we'll move away from nutrition. This is actually an example for a community leadership and action project with newcomer immigrant and refugee communities. And so your project goal is to create, implement, and sustain culturally and linguistically appropriate community-based responses to the issue of violence against women. And so your objective is to recruit 8 to 10 newcomer immigrant and refugee women with demonstrated leadership qualities to participate in a community leadership program. And your expected outcome is 8 to 10 newcomer immigrant and refugee women with demonstrated leadership successfully recruited as community leaders. So my first activity, if I want to recruit newcomer immigrant and refugee women, is actually to develop recruitment documentation. Job description, flyer, application form, interview guide, and participant agreement form. And then my timelines would be, this would be my sample timeline. My input would be actually a program coordinator to do that. And my output would actually be, and that's just simply put, would actually be a job description, a flyer, an application form, an interview guide, a participant agreement form. So that would be if my activity is to develop them, my output would be the developed tools. And my indicator, sometimes this gets asked in a work plan, would be a draft of the materials. And then the measurement would be that I know that I'm actually completing it, would be my documentation is completed within a 2-week period. So this is just an example of the level of detail that is sometimes required and included in a work plan. It depends who your funder is, but this is an example of what that might look like when you fill it out. I provided on the Google folder 5 or 6 different examples of different work plan examples, and you systematically fill out depending on what your activity might be. So if you have an activity that, if your project goal is around creating accessible software, then your objective is going to be something different. If it is creating, providing accessible mental health access for immigrant women, then your objectives are going to be something different. So you want to keep thinking through what your specific project is, and then what your objective is for your particular project.
Oh, and question for you, Bethany.
Yeah, sure.
So would you say the difference between like the work plan and the project plan would be, you see how things are grouped with the work plan?
Yeah.
Like the project plan would take each of those and give it its own line and timeline, yeah. Or what would you say is the difference?
So it would just be, so your project plan and your work plan, so it depends. So it depends on what the funding is. So I noted that in the IRP, it's more of a project plan. And so it's in bigger, like it's in broader strokes. There are some funding applications where they want this level of detail. And they are onerous to fill out. Let me tell you, I have filled out many of them. So it depends on, so this is why I provide this level of detail. But so sometimes you might have April, May 2021, here's what I'm going to do. But in this case, if it's so some government funding is this detailed. and it depends who the funder is. But you want to read carefully what each funder is asking you to provide. But the categories are often really similar, and they want to know what is your timeline, what is your output going to be, and how are you going to measure if you've been successful. Those categories are always going to be the same. How they ask you to provide the information will change up a little bit depending on who the funder is. Okay, so the next piece, and these pieces are so connected, and it's really important, is that there's a connection between your budget and your work plan. Your budget and your work plan need to be able to be read together. And that's because of this piece right here, which is your human and financial resources. So you need to make sure that the items that you include in your budget need to be in your work plan. So staff or resources in your work plan need to be in your budget, and vice versa. So they need to, a funder should not look at your project plan or your work plan and then look at your budget and say, why are they asking for a computer when they don't say that they need a computer? Or why are they asking for a software developer when they didn't actually say that they were going to develop software? So like you want to make sure that there's consistency throughout your grant proposal. And one place where people often get tripped up is when things just appear in the budget that have not been anywhere else in the entire grant application. Sneha, do you want to say anything about that? Because I think we had a discussion about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you made about having the budget correspond with the things that you've talked about in your project plan, just for exactly that reason. When you see a project description clearly saying we're going to do like A, B, C, and then you look at the budget and it matches, then it makes sense. And then but if you see a project description that talks about certain things and then the budget doesn't have those things, or sometimes the budget can be very vague. So it might be like marketing $1,000, but like no indication of what that means. That can also be, it's like, what exactly are you going to do with $1,000 to market your business?
Additionally, we have some questions in the chat.
Sure.
Soumya, I'm hoping I'm saying that right. In an IRP application, what is acceptable as a budget and what is not?
So the IRP, actually, they provided a budget template for organizations to use in this round, and it has a pretty clear format of how you should list your line items and what is eligible, and also the program guidelines also indicate what is eligible and what isn't. And I can drop the link to the program guidelines as well.
Please do. Second question, can a nonprofit organization have employees? Ryan, do you mind chiming in on this
one? Sure, yes they can. But if you're applying for the IRP, you cannot use the IRP money to hire employees. There is a way you can use it to offset if you have to take an employee out of their original role and put them onto the social enterprise project, but you cannot just hire somebody to be in your nonprofit entity as an employee. I'm pretty sure that's accurate, right, Sneha?
So I think for this round, because of COVID, they are allowing for up to 20% of your budget request to be for staffing and organizational support. So that's 20% of your total request can be allocated towards staffing and administration, for example, management staff, support staff, or rent. So that's new for this round of funding because of the impact of the pandemic on organizations.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that's really, I cannot emphasize strongly enough is that so all of the documents that Sneha has been sharing that talk about criteria and eligibility, it's so important to ensure that you follow those to the T. So if you don't follow the guidelines that are set out by a funder, and you've asked for something that is not eligible, that actually, first of all, communicates to a funder that person didn't read well, and in a backhanded way, it kind of communicates to them, is this person responsible? Will this person be responsible with money that we would give them? So you want to make sure that you are just clearly following the rules, because especially when funders are getting lots and lots of applications. So just following criteria is really important, and following rules is really important, especially in an environment where there are lots of applications, and when 30% of applications, 20 to 30% of applications often for funding pools are actually funding projects are actually funded. There are two types of revenues or contributions that are indicated on budget forms, and these are actual funds, and these are actual funds like real money, and then in-kind funds. And this refers to actually donations, contributions of time or materials, and these have monetary value but are not actually counted as actual money. And these are really important, and I want to make sure that this is one thing that you take away from this session. I want you to take a lot of things away, but is the in-kind revenues. So in-kind expenses are represented as cash, but they're not actually counted in your budget, but they can be counted in the final cost of your project. So they can be counted as a contribution and a value of all of your project. So for an example, it might be your time if you're not being paid, staff time or volunteers from the community. And this is one thing that Golnaz talked about yesterday, was talking about the number of volunteers, and possibly many of you have volunteers, people who really believe in your idea, who are working for your venture. Their time is absolutely valuable, even though you're not able to pay them right now. Their time has value, and so representing that is important. Maybe food that's donated from the community for some of your programs. A placement student who's not being paid, or space that's donated. All of those things have value, and I always, for me, sometimes on a budget form, there will be a space to include contributions. So some in-kind contributions from other sources. This for me is always an important place and space for me to invest my time to indicate all of the many different spaces where this project could not happen without the contributions, these in-kind contributions. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to people? And this does not in any way take away from your need for additional funds. It actually speaks to the connection to community, the connection to other people, and investments that others are making in your organization or in your venture. as well. So what goes into a budget? Human resources can go into a budget. In the IRP, 20% can go into a budget. Often in a project budget, this can make up the largest part of a budget. And that's because you need people to make a project happen. And this can include things like staff. Many of you, if you're at the beginning of a venture, are probably a long way, might be a few years away from being able to pay staff salaries and benefits. Hopefully not too far away. I will look forward to you being in a place where you can pay staff salaries and benefits. Things that might fit in there as well is paying honorarium to people as well. Always when when you think about salaries in the sector, if you want to know how much you should be paying people, taking a look at what people are being paid, in the sector, looking on job boards and what people are being paid. That's in terms of being competitive. And if you're not being competitive, speaking to a funder about why you've chosen to pay a particular salary range is also important. You don't want to, when I'm working with students and we're writing grant proposals, and they're thinking about what they would like to be paid, and then I explain to them how much benefits cost, and they say, "Oh, I want all these benefits, and I want to get paid this much money." And then we actually talk about what that actually looks like, and they're like, "Oh man, all my money's gone." And then you realize why there are so many jobs that are posted at contract jobs for 20 hours a week for 10 weeks. And you realize it's because of the types of funding arrangements that exist with grant proposals in the not-for-profit sector, and that there are just smaller pots of money. You might indicate in a budget form an hourly rate. It's not until you're dealing with larger, more really established projects that you might think about salary ranges, or you might think about benefits. When you actually think about extended benefits, I remember the first time that I actually worked for a large organization. I won't say what large organization I worked for, but then I worked as a manager, and I was looking at a budget form, and I was like, what the heck is this number listed right beneath the salary line? And they were like, oh, that's extended benefits. I was like, oh my gosh. We as human beings cost a lot of money, which is why 60% of the Ontario workforce are contingent workers, which are contract workers, right? So people who don't have full-time permanent work. And it's because there's a real cost to the employer. And I'm not saying this to be depressing in any way, but just to look at a reality in terms of payment. And there's just a little example here of how you might represent a cost. So if you were even thinking about paying a project coordinator for a year at $25 an hour, which is not a high range, and you're paying them at 7.5 hours a day, your employer costs, and this is a cost that you have to the government. So this is not something that your employee ever sees, but you need to pay for their OHIP and for their EI. You have a vacation pay, which they get to see. You calculate all of those pieces, and the total cost for the project coordinator would actually be $53,000, but your employee would get paid $46,000. And that's this is just an example. If you get to that point. So other things that go into a budget might be things like rent, computer, phone, materials for workshops, marketing or outreach, social media ad space, communications, printing. travel, maybe bus tickets or transit for project participants, rental of bus or van, or mileage. Mileage is a tricky piece. I included it here because you have to make sure that there's eligibility for mileage within a budget for a funder. Other things that might go into a budget might be things around translation or interpretation, things around accessibility, things around childcare, depending on who you're working with, gifts that you might give to people who come as speakers if you're not able to pay salaries to people and you're dependent on the goodwill of people to come and share their expertise, which I have been in many times in terms of asking people to come and share with the groups that I'm working with, then gifts might be something that you include as a budget line as well. What other expenses that are expenses that you are thinking of in terms of your budgets? Are there things like training or materials?
Sakina says product testing. Byravi says software program licenses.
Okay, yeah, sure. So,
materials, clinical trials.
Materials and clinical trials. So that would go, so in terms of thinking about materials, clinical trials, those kinds of things would go into like projects, so project costs in terms of what you need for the infrastructure of your project.
Jose has an interesting one, contingency. Where might that fit?
So it depends. So this is an interesting, so depending on what your, who the funder is, this is not necessarily an allowable expense. So you can't necessarily have there are some funders who allow this, a 10% of contingency that you are allowed to have in a budget. This is not something that is popular anymore. And so often, however, there will be a question, what if you don't get all the money that you ask for? How will you still run the project? And so you may be asked to talk about how you will run the project and how you will scale back if you don't get all the money you ask for. So you might have to have a contingency plan, but you don't get to have any of the money. That's a sad thing.
And I have seen, I think that's a new question that the IRP put in this cycle. But I've seen the Ontario Trillium Foundation, the Youth Opportunity Fund, you can put, I believe it's, yeah, that 10% contingency kind of as like a risk, a contingency risk for unforeseen things. On other applications, I haven't seen it.
Okay, so some of them, so Ontario Trillium Foundation put it back in.
Well, we got the Youth Opportunities Fund, so
that's
I don't know if it's the traditional.
All right, very interesting. Nice. Well, there are ebbs and flows to how things go with different funders. But yeah, so it's nice to know. So the answer to that then is they'll actually indicate on the budget form where you can actually put in the contingency if it's allowable. If they don't put it in, then you can't put it in. If that makes sense. How do you know if your budget actually makes sense? You want to have someone else read your budget, and if they can't understand it, you need to make it more clear. And the importance actually of budget justification, you can often have an opportunity to explain anything in the budget that you think might be confusing to the funder. So you can explain anything that might not make sense to the person reading the budget. So if you think that there's anything that that the funder might look at and say, there's often an opportunity in a budget justification to say, here's why I've included this. And so you can actually put some budget notes underneath the budget. But you want to try to make your budget as clear as possible. And you can get anyone to read your budget because, and you want to ask someone who doesn't know anything about your project to read it because their feedback is really valuable. No matter how you might feel about the budget process, the budget section is as important as every other part of the proposal, and you don't want to leave it until the very end. It really is about telling a story, and often you don't have to be a genius at advanced math to be able to do a budget. You need to be able to do addition, subtraction, multiplication with a calculator. And often there are formulas that are inputted that the funder has put together in the spreadsheet, but really you're telling a story through the numbers that you're providing and through the information that you are providing. The budget also reflects what you really value about your program. And like I said earlier, it really needs to be consistent with the other parts of your proposal because inconsistencies will raise red flags for funders. And as I've sat on different adjudication panels, the budget is often one place that is poorly done in grant proposals, where the committee just thinks, what's going on here? This doesn't necessarily make sense. This isn't clearly articulated. So don't leave it until the last minute. So you want to definitely use your budget to tell the story. You want to make sure that there is a theme that runs through from your project narrative, through your work plan, all the way to your budget. The other piece that is important, and this is one of the questions that came up last night as well, is if you are seeking other funding or you have other funding, you want to make sure that you tell the funder where it's coming from, or that you have other funds for the project. And maybe I'll actually get Sneha to actually speak to this. This is one of the questions actually on the IRP, talking about previous funding and future funding. And one of the areas that you want to make sure that you are answering really clearly. Did you want to speak to that, Sneha?
Yeah. So I think there's two different places where you can talk about this in your application. One of them is in the actual application itself. There's a question about your revenues from sale of goods and services. And it also asks about your plans for seeking future investment, even if you're in an earlier stage of development. And then as Bethany was saying, that you can also indicate in your actual budget other funders. So there's in the section of revenues, there's three line items. There's the Investment Readiness Program, so how much you're asking for. Then there's also your own contributions to the project. So how much are you able to contribute to this project? And then there's a line for other funders. So this is a good way to indicate that you have received successful funding from other organizations. And then there's a section at the bottom as well to indicate, just going back to what Bethany was saying earlier, in-kind support. So yeah, you can really have a holistic view of your organization and where funds are coming from and how you plan to support your project, more than just what you're asking for from the IRP.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a really, I love that you use the word holistic. And this is another way to even tell the story, right? So if you're, one of the questions in the IRP is talking about your community partnerships and the connection that you have to different community members. And so if you're actually talking about that as an answer to one of your questions, and then actually showing that in your budget in terms of the in-kind time that they've donated, in terms of even connecting to you in terms of the time that they've advised you on a particular area, and that's reflected in the budget as in-kind donation of time as a resource, then it's actually coming full circle, that you're seeing it in more than one place. And so a budget can be very strategic in that way. This is just a little piece that might be useful for you. This isn't something that the IRP asks for, but in a funding proposal that you might see at some point, sometimes a funder will ask for matching funds. So they'll ask that you find a certain amount of funding from another source. Sometimes it's from another funder, but it could also be in-kind resources. And then the funder will actually provide matching funds. So you could have funds from the Hamilton Community Fund, and then matching funds from the Ontario Trillium Foundation. So that's just a term that you might find on some grant applications. The funders also want to know how your project will continue to be funded after the grant period, and how this project will help strengthen your enterprise. And so there's a question in coming back to the IRP, there's a question that talks about your future sustainability and your future revenues. And so that's a way where you can actually speak to that, and what you're even hoping to apply to, that's also kind of forward thinking. This would be just a small example of kind of a forward thinking. So thinking through what this might look like in terms of where you might get funding from in terms of long-term planning. Sometimes a funder would be interested in seeing what your long-term planning goals are. Budget checklist, you want to make sure that all items in your budget are represented in your project outline, that all the numbers add up, that you've included both actual and in-kind contributions. You want to make sure that it's clear and concise. Could someone who doesn't know anything about my project understand my budget? And tips for savvy project planning. So if the maximum funding ask for a grant is $100,000, you should not strive to ask for the maximum amount, and ensure that what you are proposing to do in your project is actually commensurate with the expenses that you're claiming in your budget. And this demonstrates fiscal responsibility to the funder. And I'm going to let Sneha actually speak a little bit to this idea that you could apply. So the maximum amount, she said earlier in our session that the IRP, you could apply from anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000. And what did that actually look like in the last funding round, Sneha?
So in the last funding round, the highest amount in our region that was funded was $70,000, and it was for a fairly large organization. And so I would say that a lot of people asked for $100,000, but then when you looked at the budgets, it seemed like people were like applicants were trying to, they had really broad budget categories. So it would be like marketing, $40,000, product development, like $20,000 with no backup. And it was kind of like, how can I divvy up this $100,000 to show that I will be using it all? But when a reviewer looks at that, you know, it doesn't really show that there's been care taken in the project planning, unless it's a reasonable $100,000 budget. But more often than not, it was, how do I split up the amount of money in ways that show that it's being spent on something. But the stronger applications were actually those applications that asked for less, because you could see how clearly they thought out what the different elements of their project would take and how they were planning to source those things, how they were planning, if they maybe identified a consultant they were going to use, they were already working with this organization, we've costed out these items and this is how much it's going to cost. So having backup for what expenses you're claiming in your budget, and then making a reasonable ask based on what your project plans are, gives the reviewers confidence in you and also in your ability to carry it out, and that the funds won't be like wasted, because there are also midterm reports and final reports that you have to do once you have the funds. So there is a level of accountability. And I know, I think that no one wants to lose out on funding, but I think the stronger applications are the ones that are really tied to the project plans and show fiscal responsibility. And sorry, I'm just seeing a question here. What is the funding sources you mentioned? Is it for nonprofits or for business? Sorry, can you clarify that question a little further?
Yeah, I think they might be just curious what it is you are talking about.
You're talking about
it's the IRP. That's what Sneha is talking about. So I don't know if you wanted to touch on it's the investment readiness program.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Investment Readiness Program, like I mentioned earlier, is a fund by the Government of Canada and administered by the Community Foundations of Canada. And each region has a different amount of funding to distribute to social purpose organizations in our communities. And so in our community, it's the, I believe it's called the Peel, Brant, and Halton partnership. So we cover a large area, and applications opened on the 8th of September and will close on the 9th. And yes, for our region, we are reviewing applications for also partial funding. It's not an all or nothing application. And often if reviewers have questions, they may reach out to your organization to see if you can move forward with your project with partial funding. And actually that's an amendment to this round's application, where they ask you if you can move ahead with your project with partial funding. And if you can, I would strongly suggest that you hit yes, I can. It's not an all or nothing situation. So we're trying to fund organizations, as many organizations as possible. We want to move organizations forward, but it is important that your budget then reflects that fiscal responsibility.
Okay, so having said that, I'm just gonna share. I think we are we're kind of moving towards the end of our time. So I just want to be conscious of that. I'm going to share one last image with you, and this is really it's an image that's used a lot when you're talking about project planning. And it's something that I use all the time when I talk about planning for grants, for grant proposals. And if you look at, it's called the scope triangle. And if you look at, you've got the cost, so that's the budget piece, the time, so the time that you're proposing for the project, and then the scope. So how much can you do during that time? And those have to be equal. So keep that in mind when you are actually putting your project together, because when those things are equal and they make sense, then you get a quality project. So this is what was happening when you have someone saying that in a year they're going to do lots and lots of things, and it's not possible. So sometimes you get projects that are submitted that are not doing enough. Sometimes they're saying that they're going to do too much, and those are warning bells to funders when they think that's not possible, or wow, you're asking for way too much money for what you're actually saying you're going to do. So you want to make sure that these things, the time that you have, what you say you're going to do, is connected to the cost, and then you have a quality project, and you'll have a quality application. I'm gonna, there are the rest of the slides, which you'll have access to, have some great pointers for you as you think about drafting funding application, plus a lot of different resources. And so all of these are going to be available after the session, but I want to leave the last few minutes of our time together for people to ask questions about grant writing, about work plans, budgets, or about the IRP.
Bethany, do you want to keep the slides up, or maybe we can?
Oh, I can stop sharing.
Yeah, maybe we can bring them down and everybody can see each other.
Yes, I can totally take the slides down.
Makes it easier for you too.
Thank you, Cole.
I see a question from Sakina, I think. Can we get support in reviewing our applications? I think I can speak to that. I know that we have the working groups, and I believe that we have one more working group coming up.
Yep.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, we also have, you have access to each of the facilitators who came out today. You can send them an email or connect with them, and they're more than willing to help out.
Yeah.
I will say that I think the best opportunity to get support would be going to the working group, and then if you have specific questions, asking me via email. However, right now, the partners are not necessarily reviewing specific applications as a whole. But if you have questions about specific application questions, we'd be happy to help you out in that regard.
Yeah, and we'll put the we'll put the form up again for people to enter in specific challenges that you may be experiencing, and then we'll address that to everyone as well. Not your specific challenge, but we'll address those questions actually at the working group. I think it went quite well last night in terms of addressing different broad areas, and then some specific questions as well.
Yeah, and Crystal, with your question around, since you're at early stage and pre-revenue, does it make sense to apply? I would say if you focus on the fact that you are ideation stage and you are now getting the IRP to fine-tune this concept that you have in order to get it ready to go to market. A lot of times I saw a lot of applications where people in the ideation stage were trying to get money to launch the business and buy things that they needed to operate. And that's not what the IRP is for. The IRP is to help you finalize that business plan, finalize your marketing strategy, finalize your financial modeling, possibly bring on a business development consultant. So getting all those things in place to help you finish, I'll say, the paperwork side of your business. Like, what does your strategy look like to launch this thing? That's what the IRP is designed for. So it would be good for you to apply, just knowing that don't apply for, or don't put in your budget things that will help you operate. That's the only distinction I would be careful of, because that's caused a lot of people to get declined because they're trying to do both at the same time. So just stick to the ideation part of it.
Thank you. Amazing. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? We're just hitting around 6:30 right now.
I think there was just a question around who in the organization is actually eligible to apply.
I would suggest that there's the CEO be the one that puts their name down on the application. You as a team can work together to build the application. There's PDF versions online of all the questions, but when it comes down to putting a contact, I would recommend that the CEO of the organization is the contact for the application.
Yeah. And we have Sakina saying another fantastic session that gave me so much confidence to apply again. Thank you so much.
Great, good, wonderful. And we wish everyone the very best as you continue to navigate funding, and it was delightful to hang out with you again tonight.
Excellent.
Yeah, and just sorry, before we wrap up, Simi, to Crystal's point around should you apply just to get the experience, at minimum, at the end of this, if you do apply, even if you get declined, you now have a blueprint of what your whole concept is. Okay, go. And you can use this blueprint for future grants. So use this experience and let it propel or at least amplify and make you more comfortable with future grants that you're going to go for.
Yeah, and that is such great advice, Ryan. I would say that the only way that you learn how to write a good grant is by writing grants. You can't just you have to do in order to improve. And so it's the only way. If you write a proposal and then want to get feedback on after you've written it, even if you weren't successful, then you have something to bring to say, how would you improve this? And I'm wondering if someone could give me feedback on this. So
make sure and ask for that feedback. That is the key.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I think we're going to conclude our session now. Just a quick wrap up. Cole, if you could please share the slides. We wanted to thank everyone for such a great session, and we were going to send a link to our evaluation form in the chat. So if everyone could just take 2 minutes to fill that out, we would really appreciate your feedback. And as you can see, we have many really great upcoming sessions, and you can find all of these events on Sheridan's event page, which we'll also share in the chat. We wanted to remind you that we'll be having our second IRP grant writing working group on October 1st at 5 p.m. It's going to be focused on budgets and work plans, and we hope to see all of you there, as well as at upcoming EDGE sessions. And Cole, if you could just go to the next slide. These are our socials. Please connect with us and just to keep you up to date and in the loop. And finally, I would just like to take a minute to thank Bethany, Ryan, and Sneha for an amazing session. We really appreciate you taking the time for these discussions. And I would also like to thank everyone for attending tonight's session. We hope that you learned a lot, and we hope to see you at upcoming events. So thank you so much. I hope everyone has a great night.
All right.
All right. Have a good night. Good seeing everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
See you in about a week.
Good night.
Yes, see you in a week.